The morning mist rolled across vast grasslands where 30 million buffalo thundered in herds that stretched beyond the horizon. Their hoofbeats created a rhythm that had pulsed through this land for thousands of years, a heartbeat of abundance that sustained countless nations. This land had no name because it needed none. It simply was, complete, thriving, alive, perfect in its ancient complexity. The rivers spoke in languages older than memory, carrying canoes carved from mighty oaks and birch bark harvested with ceremonies that honored every tree. From the Arctic tundra, where the Inuit created sophisticated ice architecture, to the tropical forests of what strangers would call Florida, where the Calusa built great shell islands, over 500 distinct nations flourished. Each with their own governance systems that made European feudalism look primitive, their own wisdom traditions that put European philosophy to shame, their own sacred relationship with the earth beneath their feet. The Haudenosaunee had already created a democratic system so sophisticated that it would later inspire the founding fathers of a nation that didn't yet exist. The Aztec Triple Alliance governed 25 million people with administrative efficiency that surpassed anything in Europe. The Inca had built a socialist utopia that eliminated poverty across an empire stretching from modern Ecuador to Chile. Meanwhile, European peasants still lived in hovels, believing their kings ruled by divine right. But the continent didn't know it was about to become new. In the great trading centers of Cahokia, where goods from thousands of miles away changed hands in markets that rivaled Venice, merchants haggled over prices in languages that would soon be silenced forever. The city's population of 20,000 made it larger than London. Its massive plazas could hold the entire population of Rome. Its earthen pyramids rose higher than the great cathedrals of Paris. Yet in European maps, this entire region was marked as wilderness. How magnificently wrong they were! To the west, in the cliffs of Mesa Verde, Pueblo ancestors had spent centuries perfecting architectural marvels that modern engineers still struggled to understand. They built multi-story complexes into sheer rock faces, creating communities that housed thousands while maintaining perfect harmony with the desert environment. Their astronomical observatories tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. Their irrigation systems turned arid landscapes into gardens. These weren't scattered tribes scraping by in wilderness. This was civilization. Complex, sophisticated, sustainable civilization that had solved problems Europe couldn't imagine. The scientific achievements alone were staggering. Maya mathematicians had calculated the length of the solar year to 365.22420 days, accurate to within Yu-Su-2 of a day. They had invented zero independently, a mathematical breakthrough Europe wouldn't discover until much later. Their calendar system could predict eclipses thousands of years into the future. Their books contained knowledge of medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and philosophy that would be systematically destroyed by conquistadors who called it devil worship. In the highlands of Peru, Inca engineers built roads that spanned impossible mountain terrain, creating a transportation network that moved goods across 4,000 miles of challenging geography. Their bridges carried massive loads across chasms Europeans would have declared impossible to cross. Their agricultural terraces turned vertical mountainsides into productive farmland that still feeds people today. Yet, across an ocean they'd never seen, men in courts they'd never heard of were already drawing lines on maps, dividing up their homeland like pieces of cake. Columbus was still trying to convince Queen Isabella to fund his journey, never imagining he might encounter something that had been thriving for millennia. The autumn of 1491 brought the usual harvest festivals, but with abundance that would shock European observers. Cornfields stretched to the horizon, perfectly engineered varieties developed through thousands of years of selective breeding. Indigenous peoples had transformed wild grass into the foundation crop that would eventually feed the world. Their agricultural science grew varieties in every color of the rainbow, each adapted to specific conditions. Three Sisters agriculture, corn, beans, and squash, represented ecological thinking that wouldn't be understood in Europe for centuries. The corn provided a natural trellis for the beans, while the beans fixed nitrogen to feed the corn. The squash prevented weeds and conserved moisture. Together, they created a sustainable system that could feed large populations indefinitely. European agriculture was already showing signs of the exhaustion that would drive desperate populations across the ocean. The trade networks connecting these communities were more extensive than anything Europe had achieved. Shells from the Pacific appeared in Great Lakes burial mounds. Copper from Michigan reached Louisiana. Obsidian from Wyoming was traded to Ohio. The sophisticated relationships required to maintain these networks demonstrated organization and diplomacy that European feudal systems couldn't match. But the most remarkable achievement was how seamlessly these hundreds of distinct cultures coexisted. Wars occurred, certainly, but they were limited conflicts governed by strict codes of honor. The idea of total war, the European concept of wiping out entire populations to claim their resources, was literally unthinkable to most indigenous peoples. They fought for honor, for justice, for protection, but not for conquest in the European sense. The very concept of owning land was foreign to cultures that saw themselves as stewards of territories they would pass to future generations. How could they know that in just months, everything would change forever? The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was a jewel that would have put Rome to shame. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it housed over 200,000 people, making it larger than any European city of its time. Its causeways and canals created a transportation system so elegant that Spanish conquistadors would compare it to Venice, but acknowledge it was more beautiful and more efficiently designed. The floating gardens, or chinampas, represented agricultural technology so advanced that modern urban planners still study their methods. The city's markets sold goods from across North and South America. Cacao beans served as currency in a complex economy that included everything from exotic bird feathers to precious stones, from perfectly woven textiles to tools sharp enough to shave with. The social organization required to feed and house such a massive population demonstrated administrative capabilities that European cities couldn't achieve. Aqueducts brought fresh water from mountain springs. Sewage systems kept the city clean. Public schools taught reading, writing, and mathematics to children from all social classes, something unheard of in Europe, where literacy was reserved for the wealthy elite. The Aztec library contained thousands of books, codices written on bark paper and deer hide, preserving knowledge of history, astronomy, medicine, poetry, and philosophy. These books represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries, irreplaceable records of human achievement that would be methodically burned by Spanish priests who saw them as obstacles to Christian conversion. In a few short years, most of this knowledge would vanish forever, leaving only fragments to hint at the sophistication of what was lost. But in European courts, this entire continent was being labeled Terra Incognita, unknown land, empty land, land waiting to be discovered. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. How do you discover a place where millions of people are living their daily lives, governing themselves, creating art, conducting science, and building civilizations that would impress visitors from anywhere in the world? The Spanish would land at Tenochtitlan and gasp at its beauty, then systematically destroy it. They would marvel at the engineering genius of Machu Picchu, then abandon it to the jungle. They would be amazed by the mathematical precision of Maya calendars, then burn the books that contained this knowledge. The pattern would repeat across 2 continents: wonder, exploitation, destruction, denial. Winter came to the continent as it always had, bringing the season of storytelling and spiritual reflection. In Haudenosaunee longhouses, families gathered around fires that had burned continuously for generations, listening to creation stories that encoded scientific knowledge about the natural world. These stories contained practical wisdom about sustainable living that modern environmentalists are only beginning to rediscover. In the Southwest, Pueblo ceremonies connected communities to cosmic cycles they had observed for centuries. Their kivas were precisely aligned with celestial movements, creating sacred spaces where physical and spiritual worlds intersected. Northern peoples followed their seasonal migrations with precision European sailors could only dream of. The Inuit had developed over 100 different words for ice, each describing conditions that could mean life or death in the Arctic. Children were born into communities that had perfected the art of raising human beings. Indigenous education systems recognized that different children had different gifts, creating pathways for everyone to contribute. There were no homeless children, no orphans left to starve. Every child belonged to the community. Elders died peacefully, knowing their traditions would continue through oral libraries that contained more practical wisdom about sustainable living than all the written books in European libraries combined. Life continued in its eternal rhythm, but the rhythm was about to be broken forever. Spring brought the usual renewal, but this renewal carried significance none could have imagined. Young men completed coming-of-age rituals that prepared them to protect their way of life, preparing for challenges they couldn't imagine. Women cultivated new strains of crops, continuing the ancient science that had already given the world corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, and countless plants that would transform European civilization. Artists created works that would define generations soon to be scattered or destroyed. Cherokee basketry achieved new levels of complexity. Aztec featherwork created images so detailed they looked like paintings. Indigenous diplomacy operated on principles of reciprocity that created stable relationships lasting centuries. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace had established democratic procedures for everything from trade disputes to environmental protection. Thousands of years of accumulated wisdom guided every decision. This wisdom was about to be dismissed as ignorance by people who had already depleted their own continent's forests and soils. But somewhere in Genoa, a man named Christopher Columbus was still trying to convince monarchs to fund his westward journey. He dreamed of reaching the Indies, never imagining he might encounter something entirely different, something that had been thriving without European knowledge for millennia. His maps showed empty ocean where the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth had been developing sustainable societies for longer than Europeans had existed as distinct peoples. Columbus carried with him letters of introduction to the Great Khan of China, completely unaware that the lands he hoped to reach were already home to political organizations more complex than anything in Europe. He planned to spread Christianity to heathen lands, not knowing that the spiritual traditions he would encounter were older, more sophisticated, and more deeply integrated into daily life than anything European Christianity had achieved. The summer of 1491 saw the usual trade expeditions, but trade that operated on principles of gift economy that Europeans couldn't comprehend. Haudenosaunee envoys traveled south to negotiate with Cherokee leaders, carrying wampum belts that served as both currency and historical records. These weren't primitive barter systems, but sophisticated economic relationships based on principles of abundance rather than scarcity. The concept that land, water, and air could be owned and sold was incomprehensible to peoples who understood themselves as temporary stewards of permanent territories. Mississippian merchants carried goods up and down the great river networks in canoes that could transport tons of cargo. Their understanding of river currents, seasonal flooding patterns, and navigation techniques allowed them to move goods efficiently across thousands of miles of inland waterways. European river commerce was primitive by comparison, limited to small boats carrying modest loads on rivers that froze solid in winter. Pacific Northwest peoples traded with inland mountain communities, exchanging dried salmon and carved cedar for obsidian tools and buffalo hides. Their sophisticated preservation techniques allowed them to store food for years, creating abundance that supported some of the highest population densities north of Mexico. Their art, towering totem poles, intricately carved masks, and textiles woven from cedar bark, achieved levels of sophistication that European folk art couldn't approach. The continent buzzed with commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Yet none of them could have foreseen that their complex web of international relations was about to be dismissed as savage wilderness by people who had never set foot on their soil, who would arrive carrying diseases that would kill more efficiently than any weapons, who would mistake the resulting demographic collapse for evidence that the land had always been empty. The astronomical observations continued with a precision that would humble modern scientists. Maya mathematicians didn't just track celestial movements. They had identified and calculated the synodic periods of Venus, Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter with an accuracy that European astronomy wouldn't match for centuries. Their eclipse tables could predict solar and lunar eclipses thousands of years into the future. Their understanding of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, allowed them to create calendar systems that remained accurate across vast spans of time. At Cahokia, a massive timber circle called Woodhenge allowed astronomers to track the movements of the sun and stars with remarkable precision. This wasn't primitive skywatching, but sophisticated science that integrated astronomical observation with agricultural planning, religious ceremony, and urban design. The entire city was laid out according to astronomical principles, with major buildings and plazas aligned to capture specific solar phenomena. Pueblo engineers designed structures that captured every ray of solstice sunlight, creating buildings that served as both homes and scientific instruments. Their understanding of passive solar heating, natural ventilation, and thermal mass allowed them to create comfortable living spaces in extreme climates using only local materials and human ingenuity. Modern green architecture is only beginning to rediscover principles that Pueblo builders had perfected centuries earlier. Cherokee farmers read weather patterns that had guided their ancestors for generations, but their meteorology was based on sophisticated observation of natural indicators that European farmers ignored. They could predict long-term climate patterns by watching the behavior of animals, the flowering patterns of specific plants, and subtle changes in atmospheric conditions. Their agricultural calendar was so precise that they rarely experienced crop failures, even during challenging seasons. This was science, refined through centuries of careful observation and practical application. But in European universities, scholars still believed the Earth was surrounded by dangerous monsters and boiling seas. They would soon declare this ancient, sophisticated civilization to be primitive and uncivilized. The irony was staggering. Peoples who couldn't predict the weather in their own countries would dismiss as ignorant the meteorological knowledge that had sustained millions for thousands of years. The children played the same games their great-grandparents had played, but these games weren't simple entertainment. Lacrosse taught young men the teamwork, strategy, and physical conditioning they would need as adults. The rules were complex, requiring both individual skill and sophisticated group coordination. European observers would later be amazed by the athleticism and strategic thinking displayed in these games, never realizing they were watching educational systems disguised as play. Young girls learned the same songs, the same stories, the same essential truths about living in harmony with the natural world through elaborate play systems that encoded practical knowledge. Their dolls weren't toys in the European sense, but teaching tools that helped them learn the skills they would need as adults. Their games included complex social simulations that taught them how to manage households, resolve conflicts, and maintain the intricate relationships that held their communities together. They had no concept that childhood itself was about to be redefined, that their languages would be forbidden, their beliefs outlawed, their very existence questioned. How do you prepare a child for the unthinkable? How do you protect them from forces that haven't yet arrived, that exist only in the nightmares of people they'll never meet? The education systems that had produced these children were about to be declared non-existent by Europeans who couldn't read or write in their own languages. Indigenous pedagogies that recognized multiple intelligences and different learning styles would be replaced by rote memorization systems that crushed creativity and individual expression. Children who had grown up free to explore, to question, to develop their unique gifts would be forced into rigid boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. The elders spoke of dreams, and in indigenous cultures, dreams were never dismissed as mere fantasy. Strange dreams of pale strangers arriving from the direction of the sunrise had been reported across the continent for generations. These dreams were taken seriously, discussed in councils, incorporated into ceremonial life. But how do you prepare for the impossible? How do you defend against weapons you've never imagined, diseases you've never encountered, concepts of ownership and exploitation that contradict everything you know about how human beings should live? The dreams spoke of men who would claim to own the earth itself, who would tear up the soil to extract metals they valued more than life. They spoke of strangers who would cut down entire forests to build ships they would use to steal wealth from distant lands. They spoke of people so disconnected from the natural world that they would poison their own water supplies and fill their own skies with smoke. These seemed like dreams of another world, another reality entirely. Surely the Creator would not allow such disruption to the balance they had spent thousands of years perfecting. Surely no people could be so foolish as to destroy the very environment that sustained their lives. But the dreams persisted, growing stronger and more urgent as 1492 approached. The final autumn before discovery arrived like any other, but with an undercurrent of tension that medicine people across the continent felt but couldn't explain. Harvest ceremonies honored the earth's generosity with an intensity that seemed to acknowledge this might be the last time such ceremonies could be performed in the ancient way. Warriors proved their courage in traditional contests, not knowing they would soon face enemies who fought with metal weapons and rode animals larger than anything they had ever seen. Artists created beauty that would outlast empires, working with an urgency that seemed to recognize the approaching darkness. Cherokee basketry reached new levels of intricacy. Aztec scribes worked faster to record their histories. Maya astronomers made their final calculations. Pueblo potters created masterpieces that would survive in museum collections long after their creators' names were forgotten. Healers passed down knowledge that could cure diseases. European medicine couldn't even identify, but they had no remedies for smallpox, measles, typhus, or cholera. Their sophisticated pharmacology included hundreds of plants that would eventually revolutionize European medicine, but they had no defense against the invisible killers that would accompany the visible invaders. Everything continued as it always had, as it always should. The cycles of planting and harvesting, of ceremony and celebration, of birth and death and renewal that had sustained human life on this continent for countless generations. The rhythms that connected human communities to the larger rhythms of the natural world, creating sustainable societies that could have continued indefinitely if left undisturbed. But on October 12, 1492, 3 ships flying Spanish flags would make landfall in the Caribbean, and nothing would ever be the same again. Columbus would step onto a beach, plant a flag, and declare the entire continent claimed for Spain. He would never understand the magnitude of what he had just destroyed with that single gesture. The continent had no idea it was about to be discovered by people who would refuse to see what was already there. It had no idea that its sophisticated political systems would be dismissed as anarchy because they didn't resemble European monarchies. Its sustainable agriculture would be replaced with destructive monocultures designed to extract wealth rather than sustain communities. Its oral libraries would be dismissed as ignorance by people who couldn't imagine preserving complex knowledge without writing it down. Most tragic of all, it had no idea that within a generation, its very existence as a thriving, complex civilization would be denied. That history books would describe it as empty wilderness waiting to be settled, that the phrase New World would erase the ancient reality of what had always been a very old, very wise, very full world. The demographic catastrophe that followed European contact would be so overwhelming that later historians would assume the continent had always been sparsely populated. The complex urban centers would be abandoned so quickly that later explorers would dismiss them as natural formations. The intricate trade networks would collapse so completely that Europeans would assume they had never existed. The unnamed continent had been home to millions for thousands of years. It had nurtured countless innovations, supported hundreds of distinct cultures, and developed ways of living that Europeans could barely comprehend. It had been everything except empty. Its forests were carefully managed. Its rivers were clean. Its soils were rich. Its peoples were healthy, educated, and free in ways that European peasants couldn't imagine. But overnight, it became new. And in becoming new, it lost everything that had made it ancient, sacred, and complete. The morning mist still rolls across the grasslands, but the buffalo are gone. The great cities lie buried under modern developments that never acknowledge what came before. The languages fall silent, one by one, taking with them ways of understanding the world that humanity desperately needs. And somewhere in the wind that once carried the songs of 500 nations, the unnamed continent still whispers its truth. We were never empty. We were never new. We were always here, always home, always whole. We were never discovered because we were never lost. We were never conquered because our spirits cannot be conquered. We were never vanished because we are still here, still dreaming, still remembering, still hoping for the day when the world will listen to what we tried to teach about how to live in harmony with all our relations. Until the day we weren't allowed to be ourselves. Until the day we were forced to become new in someone else's story. Until the day our full world was emptied to make room for someone else's expansion. But the wind still remembers. The earth still knows. And in the places where our ancestors danced, the ground still vibrates with the rhythm of their footsteps, waiting for the day when their children's children's children will remember who they really are and dance that rhythm once again.